These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Ben Fletcher and the Industrial Workers of the World with Peter Cole. Africa World Now Project is next. The IWW was born in 1905, the same year as the first, albeit failed, Russian Revolution. On January 2, 1905, several dozen people identifying as industrial unionists met in Chicago and issued a call to form a new labor union. They declared that the great facts of present industry are the displacement of human skill by machines and the increase of capitalist power through concentration in the possession of the tools with which wealth is produced and distributed. Accordingly, that June, several hundred people belonging to more than 40 unions and radical organizations returned to Chicago, where they founded the Industrial Workers of the World. On July 8th, attendees adopted a legendary preamble to the IWW's Constitution, which boldly and famously declared, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things in life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the toilers come together and take and hold that which they produce by their labor." Clearly, the IWW believed in class struggle and the need for a proletarian revolution to bring socialism to the world. However, like most socialists and later communists, the IWW did not privilege political means for achieving socialist ends. Rather, the IWW and other syndicalist organizations saw industrial unions, direct action on the job, and the climactic general strike as the logical and best ways to enact revolutionary change. Already in 1905, and even more so after 1908, this ideological distinction mattered a great deal. The question that comes to fore today begs us to ask, is it time for this ideological difference to be reassessed for its efficacy? What are the categories of thought assessed through practice over time and space up until this point relevant to be included in our analysis that is necessary to redirect, realign current labor struggles to emancipate our labor power? The IWW from its inception committed itself to organizing all workers regardless of their ethnic, national, racial, or gender identities. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution's bylaws declared, "No working man or woman shall be excluded from membership in local unions because of creed or color." The founders made this point clear because of the noted racism, sexism, and xenophobia of many unionists in the AFL, as well as in organizations claiming to be socialist. Similarly, the IWW organized in the supposedly impossible American South, where black and white workers managed to overcome pervasive racism to form the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, BTW. Despite laws and customs that prevented interracial or biracial unionism, the BTW, which emerged independently but quickly affiliated with the IWW, lined up tens of thousands of black and white men in Louisiana and Texas. From 1910 to 1913, employers used lockouts, strikebreakers, private police forces, including Pinkertons, and racism to prevent workers from organizing. This campaign gave lie to the notion that the IWW could not organize in the South among rural workers and across racial lines. The IWW successfully organized timber workers primarily in the Northwest for many years to come. Only the concerted, repressive efforts of the United States government, including the deployment of Army troops to break strikes and replace Wobblies, prevented the IWW from dominating this industry into the 1920s. The other major IWW effort to organize African Americans occurred on the Philadelphia waterfront, where for almost a decade, The IWW's Marine Transport Workers Local 8 dominated one of the nation's largest ports. As in Louisiana's Piney Woods and Massachusetts' textile mills, on Philadelphia's docks, employers of longshoremen, those who load and unload cargo, had built a diverse workforce that was roughly 1/3 African American, 1/3 European immigrant, and 1/3 Irish American. The heterogeneity often prevented workers from organizing effectively, but the IWW directly challenged this issue. Born out of a successful strike in 1913, Local 8 represented upwards of 5,000 dock workers, among them the Wobblies' most well-known African-American Ben Fletcher. A brilliant speaker and organizer, Fletcher, together with other Wobbly organizers, black and white, native-born and immigrant, forced employers to hire Local 8 members exclusively for nearly a decade. As in the Northwest Woods, the government collaborated with employers as well as the AFL's Longshore Union to undermine the Wobblies. Unlike most other places, Local 8 held onto power until nearly 1923 before succumbing to ferocious pressures and repression, and it remains the Wobblies' most impressive example of interracial unionism, perhaps the most integrated union in the United States in its time. In the early 20th century, when many U.S. unions disgracefully excluded Black and Asian workers, the industrial workers of the world intentionally organized and included people of color as they intended to center class solidarity articulated in their motto, "An injury to one is an injury to all." A brilliant union organizer and sharp-witted orator, Benjamin Fletcher was a tremendously important and well-loved African-American member of the IWW during its heyday. Fletcher helped found and lead Local 8 of the IWW's Marine Transport Workers Industrial Union, unquestionably the most powerful interracial union of its era, taking a principled stand against all forms of xenophobia and exclusion. Today, I speak with Peter Cole, where we contextualize and expand on the work of the IWW and the influence of Ben Fletcher. We weave together a tapestry of places, experiences, and movements that culminate into a lens through which we use to understand the life and influences of Ben Fletcher and the IWW. Peter Cole is a professor of history at Western Illinois University and research associate in the Society Work Development Program at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He is the author of Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Era Philadelphia, the award-winning Dock Worker Power, Race and Activism in Durban and the San Francisco Bay Area, and editor of Wobblies of the World, A Global History of the IWW, and the recently re-released Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly. Peter Cole is also founder and director of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project and publishes widely on internationalism, labor, and race. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Enjoy the program. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today to have a very robust conversation around the work that you have been doing around the IWW, the Wobblies, of course, and also, this labor as a broader category, but also how it leads into specific radical movements. There's an extensive cache of work that you have developed, Wobblies on the Waterfront, one of your first books, Wobblies of the World, A Global History. You co-edited Dock Worker Power, Race and Activism in Durban and San Francisco, I guess say South Carolina. And Ben Fletcher, of course, one of your latest works. And what we intend to do, what I hope we can do today, I don't even know if we could do this in one sitting, but really just kind of unpack or at least lay the frames or the paths that would allow anyone who engages this conversation and is inspired to engage any part of your work, that they can pick up on the themes that kind of connect. What is it that you're intending to do in the context of studying presenting history to explain the present and mapping the future. What can they pull on? What thread did they pull on and kind of ride that wave, into the moment? And of course, this moment is very interesting. There's a rise of labor activism. There's a strong independent current of activism that is kind of reminiscent of what you study. So with that being said, again, thank you. No long introduction. This is probably the most that people will hear me in this conversation, and I'm just going to kind of guide it. But thank you for taking the time to join us, Cole.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor also, as always, to talk with someone who's knowledgeable about these same subjects and to sort of speak with the people who you connect with in your way you sort of on your platforms, right? Thanks. My pleasure.
And it's very important because I'm glad you said, this notion of a platform, because, one of the areas or one of the important platforms that you study in the context of radical labor organizing is the port, or what we can just basically say a portal, portal to the world. But before we begin to get there, let's just go broad and then we'll just kind of map it out from there. Who is the IWW? What can the history of the IWW teach us about the present moment? And more importantly, what are some of the themes as you lay out? Because I'm very interested in the broad spectrum organizing that is in the context of the IWW, this notion of connecting social justice grassroots struggles, but also workplace struggles. There is no separation into that. So let's start there and we'll map it out from there.
Of course, we could talk for an hour just about that. But in 1905, when the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, was founded in Chicago, which is where I'm speaking to you from today, imagine a world where sort of a very small number of people and corporations control much of the wealth, where the government essentially is subservient to these big corporate interests willingly, right? That both main parties actually are sort of serving the interests of capitalism, you could say, fairly, I think, and would have been proud to say it. But also imagine a time with where xenophobia was rampant, where racism was rampant, where sexism was rampant, where nationalism, sort of a corollary to xenophobia, was rampant, but also a time where the labor movement was very, very weak. Where the existing unions, most of whom were in the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, chose to organize only a small sector of the working class, right? Like chose to organize only skilled workers, generally men, generally white men, generally men of native-born descent, excluding, therefore, women, African Americans, and other workers of color, and at least some, if not many, immigrants, which is to say that the existing labor movement chose to not organize the majority of the working class, right? And therefore, a group of radicals, socialists, unionists, anarchists, and others from the US and other countries met in Chicago in order to create a new vision based around a new institution, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a union, because although they were Marxists, they were not socialists. They didn't believe in social democracy, then represented by the Socialist Party of the United States, and also sort of European social democracies. This precedes, of course, the birth of the Soviet Union and communism, but they weren't communists either. And although influenced by the anarchist tradition, weren't quite anarchists either, right? And so it's sort of a radical revolutionary left union that saw the pathway to socialism to come through where ordinary people had their greatest power, which was at the workplace, and that the greatest weapon of workers was the strike. Because, and of course, in 1905, this was 30 years before American workers had the legal right to unionize or strike. And so, in fact, most strikes historically were the right to force employers to negotiate, right? Because employers had no legal obligation. Of course, in our times, we might see Starbucks and others having a legal right to negotiate, but failing that and hiring activists, et cetera, right? So the IWW was founded. to sort of build a new society from within the ashes of the old, their language, right? Which is to say, through some collective general strike, that a new society would be born. That society would not be an American society, but a global society. That's why their name is the industrial workers of the world. They, in fact, chose to name themselves that. They did not name themselves, as some suggested, the industrial workers of America, because they understood capitalism as a global system, and therefore the solution to be a global one, right? That also meant that all workers are on our side and employers on the other. Famously, in their preamble, workers and employers share nothing in common. So that means that although we are different in many ways, Black workers, immigrant workers, women workers, we're all workers, right? And that is only the only ones who win if we divide ourselves are the bosses, right? And so it would be stupid as well as illogical, right? As well as unsuccessful to sort of promote divisions based on race, on nationality, on sex, on type of work one does, et cetera. Now, these are big ideas, right? And they're not unique, and they're not actually brand new, although some of them are, right? They're part of a longer tradition, and others will build on the IWW or take some things from the IWW, right? But that was their sort of general notions when they sort of came together in 1905. And then, over the next 15 years or so, they became undeniably the most powerful revolutionary union in the United States and among the most powerful in the world, which also helps explain why employers and the government hated them and deeply persecuted them. And while they didn't drive them out of existence, they largely drove them out of power by the mid 1920s, if not sooner. Yeah. So that's maybe a good start on the IWW.
Yeah, and no, let's contextualize the history right now. I mean, I think it's very important to talk about, this is in the context of a global economic shift that is happening after the Civil War, that's having implications or ramifications across the world. At the same time, this is after the 1884 Berlin Conference. There is a push to really consolidate after chattel slavery and global economy that is based upon extraction of resources and labor. So this environment becomes a very important environment to kind of look out and place, the formation of the IWW in a contextualized global history. Again, pun intended, for global history and the work that you co-edited it as well. Could you talk a little bit about some of those currents that was happening that allowed it to be a very rich, robust platform?
Yes, well, I mean, so again, it founded and based in Chicago, at that time, the greatest industrial city in the United States and perhaps the world, right? Like the US by the early 20th century has supplanted Britain and Germany as sort of the most industrially strong nation, if not the most militarily and politically one. The US already, of course, had an empire, informal, the IWW was especially strong in industries that were sort of really natural resource extraction, that actually could easily apply to much of the colonized world, as well as actually the United States. So the copper miners out west, farmers out west, are two examples or agricultural workers out west, two of the industries that the IWW was strongest in the United States, which was their base, if not their only place. Very quickly, within a few years, IWW ideas and organizers, every IWW member was an organizer. They didn't really have paid organizers. They were true believers that the revolution was coming soon. And so within a few years, Canada and Mexico had locals. Right. The IWW was actually very strong in sort of the mines of northern Mexico, but also in the greatest oil city, port city, Tampico, on the Caribbean coast of Mexico near Veracruz. Right. But the sailors actually from the IWW started organizing across South and Central America. So it was very strong in Chile, for example, all the way across the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand. The first union in New Zealand, then part of the British Commonwealth, to organize Maori, right, the indigenous people of New Zealand, was the IWW, right? Because they were not just anti-racist in the United States, they were anti-racist everywhere they went, including Australia, which was a deeply racist society, where the Aborigines were sort of almost wiped out, but also where Asians, Australia being close to Asia, were essentially denied admission for the better part of a century. The IWW also managed to make its way down to southern Africa, then actually also still part of the British Empire, right? Not yet independent until 1910, right? And was the first predominantly white union or radical organization organized Black Africans, right? And all along the way, they brought this motto of theirs: an injury to one is an injury to all. That's sort of like a short version of an even shorter word, solidarity, which are sort of the core values of the IWW, which sort of explain we're all in this together. No transgender bathroom divisions here, right? Like we're going to focus on who's got the power and what's the source of power, which is economic power, and with the goal to sort of essentially seize that power, right? For all of us, right? Like, and so the global context is important. I agree. The IWW also organized in numerous countries in Europe, including England, but it's noteworthy that the IWW spread to maybe Asia the least so, but like at least 5 of the 6 populated continents, right, within a decade, right? Like this small, plucky revolutionary outfit, which is why they captivated many people's attention, is because they seem to sort of be, well, revolutionaries in their beliefs, which means that they were committed, so that they were willing to do more, right, than others were, not simply to get a raise, although they were not opposed to workers earning more money and work for fewer hours. But those are short-term goals, right? And they also very much had long-term goals.
And the proliferation of these core values, of course, is very important in the context of the internationalism, which is a theme that you're studying. And that internationalism is moving through, as I mentioned earlier, as we opened up the conversation, this notion of dock workers, ports, portals. When we look at revolutionary thought, particularly even during anti-slavery movements, we look at the connection of the Black radical thought or Black radical traditions. It moves. I mean, you get pamphlets, David Walker's pamphlet that is moving through ports. You get the papers and information that is moving in and out of very marginalized societies, whether it's apartheid South Africa, Jim Crow United States. These ports become these intellectual and also practical grounds of development, particularly in labor organizing. These are workers at the dock, but they're also going home. So there's no separation of anti-capitalism that is a strand, and also the notion of anti-racism that is happening as well.
So yes, the first industry of capitalism is born with the first sort of means that Europe comes to dominate the world for the last 500-600 years, right? Which is the ship, right? European shipping technology was supreme in the 14 and 1500s, the Portuguese and the Spanish, later the Dutch, the French, the English, etc. Right? Like that's how they came to conquer the world, right? Like maritime industry also can be understood as the first industry, right, of the capitalist world. And as others, including Marcus Rediger, said, you might think of the ship as the first factory, right, where there's this clear division between us and them, between workers and employers, and no chance for workers to become ship owners, right? Of course, that workforce was also polyglot, right, including people from whatever flag nation that they flew, but also from their colonies. And so, of course, the literature of Herman Melville is replete with Black and brown workers, right? Indigenous people, as well as Africans, as well as people of African descent who had ended up in the Americas, right? Who populate the ranks, right? Like, and many sailors didn't sail for their entire lives. A lot of them ended up in port cities when they, stopped shipping, and might end up working on the waterfront in another capacity, right? Unloading and loading ships, right? And so, like you said, there's a long history of Black maritimers. Of course, that goes originally to Africa in sort of pre-modern times, but also in sort of the last 3 or 4 centuries. Like you said, it was Black sailors who were smuggling David Walker's appeal into southern ports, and therefore were not allowed to disembark, for example, from Charleston, because they were understood to be a threat, spreading the word not only of Walker's appeal, but also the Haitian Revolution, famously, right? Like, and were very supportive of and helpful in and part of these sorts of local, regional, global networks of to help Africans escape, right, from slavery, not just in the United States, but also outside, right? And then in the 20th century, well, of course, we are who we were, right? And so many African Americans remain dock workers and sailors, right? Particularly in the Southeast, but also in some places outside of the American South, Philadelphia being actually pretty close to the American South and having the largest Black population outside of the American South at the turn of the 20th century, right? And of course, one of those people was a man named Ben Fletcher, whose parents were migrants from Virginia, fleeing, we might say, the racial violence and terror of the 1880s, as Jim Crow is about to emerge and as Reconstruction has been defeated, right? Why his parents leave, we don't know for sure. Were they enslaved themselves as children born before the Civil War? Very likely, although that's not certain. But Ben Fletcher, born in 1890 as a native son of Philadelphia, joins the IWW in 1910. Right, and the Socialist Party, although he'll probably leave the Socialist Party soon after, right? And starts to organize. He's probably the first African-American organizer in the IWW, at least in Philadelphia. At that time would have been a white majority institution. And Fletcher was also probably working as a dock worker, a longshoreman. At that time, the entire workforce was male, so longshoreman wasn't inaccurate if gendered. Now we might say longshore worker. I also use the word dock worker for nowadays. But that Fletcher was a working class Black man from Philly. Why does he join the IWW? I wish I knew, although I could guess, right? Well, the system didn't work for him, right? Like he was a Black man, he was a working class man, he was born into a poor family, he was a day laborer, and at least some of the time used his strong back to load and unload ships because Philly was the third biggest city and maybe the fifth biggest port in the country at that time. And there was thousands of men who worked on the waterfront in Philadelphia and other port cities, Irish and Irish American, East European immigrants, African Americans, all sort of would have toiled on the Delaware River, which is the east side of the city of Philadelphia. And on the east side of the Delaware River, of course, is New Jersey, as Camden, New Jersey, specifically. And so, this is sort of the world where suddenly the IWW emerges, not just in general, but on the Philadelphia waterfront, because they have a handful of dynamic leaders. They've organized other industries in Philadelphia, including textiles, which had several 100,000 workers in Philly. But you've got this African-American leading a predominantly white institution at that time. I cannot imagine there were many others of that sort in 1913. When in May of 1913, 4,000 to 5,000 dock workers, essentially the entire workforce of the Philadelphia waterfont, struck. They struck to be recognized, to have a union. They struck to get raises. And out of that was born an IWW affiliate, often called Local 8 of the Marine Transport Workers Industrial Union, led off and on by its most well-known member, Ben Fletcher, who was also a dynamic speaker and was quickly dispatched to other ports on the East Coast, especially ports where there were African Americans or other Black people. So Norfolk, Virginia being a nearly all Black longshore workforce, Baltimore having a significant African American dock workforce, or even Providence, Rhode Island, which had a lot of Blacks from the Azores and Cape Verde, which were, of course, Portuguese colonies, right? And we may know that southern New England, right, has a Portuguese population to this day. Some of those are Black Portuguese people, right? Or people that were colonized by Portugal, which, of course, was the first European colonizer of Africa and developed plantation sugar in the 15th century. And so, like, it all comes together, right? And Ben Fletcher becomes very effective at unionizing Black and white workers, and very effective at thumbing his nose at the bosses, I guess we could say, right? Like, especially because he was known also as not just brave, but also very humorous. And so he could brilliantly explain why workers needed to unionize across racial and ethnic and national divides.
Which is very important because, I mean, this is also a form of obviously organizing intelligence, being able to really take complex or what seems to be complex ideas of how to organize, what the bosses are doing to the workers, and him being able to articulate, those exploitative practices becomes very important. And so we'll definitely get to Ben Fletcher just a little bit more. But before we go there, I want to take a moment to pause on dock worker power. We talked about this, and this is a material example of what we're talking about. What seems to be broad, complex, yet basic ideas of the relationship between livable wage, safety, and also education in the communities and safety for communities outside of the workplace. Your work in dock worker power really shows that. Could you talk a little bit more about, the relationship? Because it seems to me that you talk about technology in there, which is a real important, there's a couple of themes, but technology is one of those themes that I think is really important to talk about at this particular. Talk a little bit about, dock worker power, your book, Dock Worker Power, those relationships, international relationships, and how fighting for equality in the workplace in one locality is also simultaneously being done in international context as well.
Of course, I'd love to do that, hopefully succinctly. The dock workers, I say, have power for a bunch of reasons, but if we sort of just move backwards to the word strike, which I suggested earlier is maybe workers' most powerful weapon, that has a maritime origin, right? It was sailors in London, England, the most powerful port in the world in the 18th century, where sailors took down the sails of their ship, which is to say they stopped work and they wouldn't put the sails back up until they got a raise. The nautical term is to strike the sail, right? And that becomes the word that we all use to this day in every workplace shutdown, right? It tells you, again, the sort of importance of maritime, right? The trade is really sort of the foundation for economic exchange, and that preceded capitalism. But in the capitalist era, right, trade is sort of remains sort of fundamental. It's an industry, right? And those who work in that industry potentially have power, especially, I say now we use this term supply chain, right? And any chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Another way to think about that is whoever is able to sort of break that link, right? Who can break those links? Well, collective workers. Individual workers stop, it's irrelevant, right? But if all the workers in a particular port or particular coast or particular industry coordinate collectively, right, they potentially have greater power, right? And so that is why I focused on the US West Coast, because the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, ILWU, remains to this day among the strongest unions remaining in the United States, but also across the world. This union remains disproportionately unionized, whereas very few workers and very few workplaces actually are unionized. And so I'm interested in that. I think that's really important to understand. I don't want to sort of only focus on people who work in logistics. Workers outside of that industry also potentially have power, although not all workers are equally powerful, right? There are some industries, I believe, that actually are more interesting to sort of organize or important to organize because of their centrality, right? And so keeping that in mind, and if you accept that, right, my book, Dock Worker Power, then says, okay, what have workers done not only to improve their own material conditions in the short term, what else have they done with that power? And I've suggested that the IWW on the West Coast, especially its largest local, which was before the 1980s, the largest port in the West, San Francisco and Oakland, that those workers use their power on behalf of other causes, including racial equality, as well as against colonialism, fascism, and imperialism. Right. So, for example, the ILWU Local 10, the San Francisco local, was 99% white upon birth. When I say 99%, that's not an exaggeration, right? But within by the mid 60s was majority African American, right? With also other workers of color in addition, right? And so that union, which was led and had many in the ranks who were radical whites, essentially actively diversified itself. This is in the generation prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which mandated the end of segregation. And so I say that basically workers integrated their ranks, but also promoted racial inclusion from below, as opposed to being forced from above by policy or employers, right? Local 8, just to confuse us, in the IWW did the same thing on the Philadelphia waterfront in the 19 teens. They actually sort of actively integrated the ranks of dock workers when employers had created segregated gangs, right? And they didn't do this, didn't negotiate it. They actually simply started doing it, right? These are suggestions of power. I also note that in my book, Dock Worker Power, that Black workers in Durban, South Africa, Durban being the largest port in South Africa and busiest port in Africa for many generations, and still among the most important ports in the Southern Hemisphere, right? That they also engaged, even though they didn't have legal rights because of apartheid, to unionize or strike. They nevertheless organized collectively to try to drive up their wages, but also to resist the system of apartheid, because you could not sort of disentangle political and economic power in South Africa, or I would suggest anywhere. But in particular in South Africa, it's sort of obvious that the state is enforcing apartheid, right, and created apartheid, right? And just to sort of tie these together, right, that San Francisco Bay Area dock workers on multiple occasions in the early 60s through the late 80s agitated on behalf of, in solidarity with, Black workers in South Africa by refusing to unload cargo that arrived on ships that carried South African cargo, right? And so to engage in political activism, a dock worker's generally's job is to load and unload whatever is on the ships, right? They don't ask where this is from and what they're doing, but on these cases, and I should note, they did this in other situations to protest fascism or imperialism in other countries. They selectively chose to not load or not unload cargo to engage in political activism, right? So instead of waiting for the US State Department to sort of take a stand on what in other countries' politics are about, that working people themselves can do so. And I also then talk about how Durban dock workers have done that on occasion, both historically for a few days in 1935 after the Italians invade Ethiopia. Dockers in Durban and other ports in Southern Africa refused to load food that was intended for the Italian invading army, right, led by Mussolini, right? And in more recent times, to protest against the brutal regime of their neighbor in Zimbabwe, that in 2008 were using guns to kill the people of Zimbabwe so that Robert Mugabe could maintain power. And so these Durban dockers refused to unload weapons intended for their landlocked neighbor Zimbabwe. Right, and we could even talk further about those sorts of things, right? But those are examples of how A, dock workers have power, B, how they've used that power, right, intentionally for political ends, not simply to improve their own short-term material interests. Although I do think that unions should and do that also, right? I'm happy to make more money and work fewer hours, right? But that's not the only thing that a union potentially can do. Most unions don't engage in this sort of activism. Some do, but and not just dock workers and not just these, right? And of course, it implies that all unions could, right? Now, as for the technology aspect, if I could just quickly attempt to sort of talk about that, well, technology changes, right? Change is constant, and the way we do things involves change, right? Like that is what it is. The question always is who benefits and who loses when changes occur, right? And also keeping in mind that we historians appreciate nothing is inevitable, right? How things happen varies, right? And depends on who has the power, and so as the traditional ways of loading and unloading ships changed in the 1960s and 70s through a process called containerization. Containers, these 40-foot metal boxes that we're all familiar with. We see them on the backs of trucks. We see them on railroad cars. We also see them, thousands of them now, on ships. This new system was actually born in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. The ILWU on the West Coast was the first dock union to negotiate the transition, and the Port of San Francisco, really the first union to deal with automation, if we might also call it that. There were huge consequences of that, right? Now, this union had some power, but limited power, and in a country that was very pro-capitalist and very anti-union, right? And so they negotiated a relatively good deal for their current members, which is to say they commanded a share of the wealth, right? What happened was shipping profits would soar as productivity soared, but also as the total number of workers in that industry plummeted, right? And so the effects of that is that today, still, and also on the East Coast of the United States, dock workers make really good money, right, for working class manual laborers, right? More than many professors, as I like to say. And if I couldn't be a professor, I might want to be a dock worker if I could get into the IWW. Angela Davis has said that, but I actually independently also have said that, although I later learned she says it too, right? Although I appreciate that more people hear her. They are still a small percentage of the total cost of shipping, but because there's so few workers and the technology is actually mighty, right, that productivity increases, and that resulted in a huge increase in the amount of trade around the world. It also resulted in another unintended consequence, the movement of manufacturing from Europe and North America actually to Asia, right? Which is a whole nother thing, but of course is another consequence of containerization, right? Like that's enormously important, right? And that did weaken workers, right? And so mindful of that. And in Durban, by the way, it resulted when it was introduced in the late 70s in a 50% decrease in workers overnight, right? Without a penny of earnings going to workers because they didn't have a union that was strong enough to sort of command a share of the wealth or a share of the machine, as they said in the 60s in San Francisco. So, of course, we continue to face issues related to automation, and some of us fear it and some of us embrace it. It's selective, and it depends on where we are, right, in the world and the economy, right? Like professors are now thinking about AI and our students, right? But other people are thinking how great it is, right, that AI will be able to help me sort of make my tasks easier, right? And so, as usual, the question is who wins and who loses, right? Change and technology being one aspect of change will continue, right? But in a society where the few don't control the wealth, actually technological change might be much better, right? I don't think that dock workers were anti-technology, but I do think that all workers are worried when technology is introduced by employers, are done so without sort of mutual consent, and also asking who sort of are the beneficiaries, including economic beneficiaries, of when technologies are introduced, right? And so dock workers are sort of the canaries in the coal mine, you might say, when we think about technology and change. But of course, many others were thinking about it too, including famously Martin Luther King in the 60s, but James Boggs, whose work I've been trying to read more of recently, who actually took some views on automation that I'm not sure I agree with, but I'm interested in knowing what he thought, because I think those are, well, we have to grapple with these issues, right? But King and Boggs are actually two of the most important African Americans in the 1960s who are seeing how automation wasn't just impacting the waterfront. That's actually a small number of workers, but many other industries, most famously, as you know, the introduction of cotton machinery in the 40s and 50s and 60s drastically reduced the number of Black workers in cotton production, right? And although those jobs might have been bad, it's better than not having a job, right? And so fast forward, we might think these issues resonate and are relevant to us today.
And it's very important because I'm glad you mentioned James Boggs, because I've been doing a lot of political education in the context of labor, working with a number of groups, and so just thinking about that in the context becomes a very important point. But one of the things that I want to, as we kind of put a pin in our conversation, because again, I don't want to take too much of your time, but again, we could talk about, there's so much that we could talk about. What is interesting about this environment, there are multiple prongs, there are multiple components that are happening in the context of workers, whether it's on dock workers in relation to other industries that are organizing. And the IWW seems to me to be a very inviting, flexible, but yet staunchly principled, radical organization. And to me, there seems to be a relationship between the collective idea of organizing, but also the idea of leadership not being in a structured, limited conceptualization of leadership, which brings in Ben Fletcher. You mentioned Ben Fletcher, you gave a little bit of that particular history, and Ben Fletcher seems to be one who's able to articulate the ideas. There's anarchism that's here, that's very important. That's the idea of the capitalist, the state. There's all of these currents that are being really fashioned by the IWW and the workers, who have a very clear understanding of the relationship between the workplace and also the environments within which the workplace is connected to. So with that being said, those strands of idea, could you talk a little bit about, if you can, the platforms, the use of ideology and theory in the context of organizing? And you could do that in the context of Ben Fletcher as an example of that.
Of course, I'll try. Ben Fletcher, very intelligent, not formally schooled, as far as we know, probably didn't graduate high school. Of course, most working class boys didn't graduate high school in the early 20th century, right? But we know from his writings and the way people commented on his speeches that he was deeply knowledgeable. Many dock workers and maritime workers had free time, especially in the winter, right? And so they would have been they were voracious readers. We also, even from the sort of, when they were imprisoned, Fletcher and other Wobblies during and after World War I in Leavenworth, we know that they were reading, right? Like they sort of talked about the books they were reading and had reading groups and whatnot, right? Like they were very interested in understanding the world that they lived in, right? And understanding why things were the way they were. And for Fletcher, as I don't think I would call him an anarchist, but Fletcher and probably the great majority of African Americans, I would suggest, had no reason to believe in the democratic political system in the United States because it had done so poorly by African Americans. Of course, women couldn't vote, period, at that time, right? But Black men had been disenfranchised, right? And so why say that we're going to achieve sort of radical results through the ballot box, right? When the ballot box is actually simply unavailable. Many European immigrants chose not to naturalize, actually, until World War I and after, where there was a, quote, Americanization campaign, because there was a lot of people going, what's the point of becoming a citizen? Which is to say that the majority of dock workers in Philadelphia probably couldn't vote, even though they were men, right? Before 1920, right? And so that sort of pitch, vote for candidate X or Y, you could just sort of put it aside, right? They understood very well, and Fletcher could explain very clearly why it was that we needed to organize at the workplace, right? Because that was where people, ordinary people, which is to say working class people, had power, potentially, right? And so there were, of course, others, including, I like to note, some Spanish anarchists who made Philadelphia their home in the 19-teens, who probably would have explained their views on these issues in a slightly different way, right? And that some of those Spanish sailors worked sugar ships that came from Cuba, particularly, but maybe other Caribbean places, to sort of bring the unrefined sugar that was refined on the Philadelphia waterfront. And I should note, for those who are unaware, that most American big port cities had sugar refineries, right? And would have essentially provided sugar for those regional economies, right? And so these folks are coming up from Cuba. Of course, there's a deep and long tradition of anarchism in the Iberian Peninsula and then the Caribbean, right? And that some of those folks sort of spread their word and make their homes in the U.S. cities, right? And so they would have had one of those guys, Manuel Rey, ended up in prison with Fletcher in Leavenworth, right? And so they would have been in this multiracial, multinational community, right? And that, no doubt, would have been fascinating, right? Of course, also before the car, they all would have lived close together and could have walked or taken those short streetcars. And now in the US and many countries, there's a very different way we live. We are much more physically dispersed and segregated, right? By class as well as race. And so there's that, right? But Fletcher would have sort of been sort of talking in those sorts of ways, especially suspicious of statism, but also suspicious of the AFL. Fast forward to our decades, right? This wave of new unionism happening, especially in retail, especially in food service, at REI, at Starbucks, at Amazon, at Apple, at Trader Joe's, at Home Depot, et cetera. many of these workers are not organizing in traditional unions, right? The AFL-CIO is sort of caught flat-footed. Now, I'm a member of the American Federation of Teachers, which is in the AFL-CIO, right? But I'm mindful that actually to this day, many mainstream unions don't devote the majority of their resources, which is to say their money, to organizing, right? They're basically serving the current membership, which may or may not be progressive, right? It's exciting to see young people, not only young people, but disproportionately young people thinking that unions are a path towards short and long-term wealth and power. It's depressing to see that many mainstream unions, even a few years into this, have been incredibly slow to sort of encourage this, right? If I was the American Federation of Teachers or the United Mine Workers, or insert any union here, I would be hiring 5,000 organizers, right? Including those Starbucks workers who are being fired by Starbucks for unionizing, right? And throwing them into union campaigns across the country, just like happened actually in the mid and late 1930s, when in fact the United Mine Workers and other unions were hiring and throwing in radicals into union campaigns because you take advantage of these moments. They are rare. And so we don't need to talk about Joe Biden as the most pro-union president in US history, as he claims, right? But we can be aware actually that he's less anti-union actually than many presidents, right? That there's all this energy in many places. The IWW's principles resonate, right? Because they're direct action, they're radically inclusive, although the Wobblies historically weren't talking about homosexuality and LGBTQ, right? That's sort of a part of this, right? They're very anti-xenophobic, and that too resonates, I think, with a large number of people around the world, right? In a time where the America actually has its high rate of immigration today as it did in the early 20th century, right? And so like IWW and similar organizing strategies are really where we see Amazon labor unions, Starbucks workers, REI workers. They're doing this. They're doing it peer to peer, right? They're often sort of workers in one Starbucks location are actually the ones who are being reached out to by unorganized workers in other Starbucks in order to tell me how to do this. How can we do this using the same technologies that we might be using now, like Zoom, right? It's not being done because the AFL-CIO is sending union organizers into, right? And also all these sorts of unaffiliated so-called SALTs, right? Radical workers who basically are joining workplaces in order to unionize them, right? In order to sort of basically unionize. This was also not unique to the IWW, right? But it requires a level of commitment on the part of workers as opposed to union organizers. I'm not anti-union organizer, but both are necessary. But one is actually driving these, right? And so employers are afraid because like they should be, because there's much more sympathy towards unions today than in 60 plus years, supposedly. And we're seeing that, but it actually has not resulted yet in a huge spike in union membership. In part because US labor law has been so anti-union for so long that it's actually hard, even all these Starbucks workers voting to unionize, not one new contract, right? The fact that actually you have to organize individual shops instead of company-wide. In the 30s, you had a single vote and suddenly General Motors was union. And now you have to organize 8,000 different workplaces. Geez, I wonder why it's much harder to organize, right? That's not coincidence. That's actually part of the design, right? And so it's exciting to be, there's more interest in Ben Fletcher specifically. And the book I wrote about Ben Fletcher now, I actually wrote my first book on Ben Fletcher. It came out 15 years ago, right? I'm thrilled that there's so much more interest. I think interest, relatively small in the scheme of things in my work, is because of this larger, right? The people's interest in labor history is always a product of what's going on in labor in the world around us, right? And so it's, in the 90s, it was a lonely place to be talking about unions and radical unions and multiracial unions. Now, there's 100 times more interest, which is pleasing to me. I still believe, as I did then, thanks in part to our friend Maurice Jackson, actually, that this sort of organizing is necessary if you do want to make radical change, and who doesn't, we can all sort of create a laundry list of problems in our world, right? And a lot of them, if not all of them, are due to sort of the powers that be, as opposed to the you and me.
And this is a perfect place to put a pin in a conversation, because what we're witnessing was very, very interesting as someone who studies critical consciousness formation through the use of radical thought and practice, looking at it as a measure or a critique of human rights. That's where I kind of rest my my interest a lot. And so, labor and Fletcher and the ability to deconstruct and disrupt normative ideas, whether it's in a labor union and how organizing and how labor is constructed. It's very interesting because I'm thinking about Henry Herbert Harrison, when Africa awakes, this notion of a consciousness development. So people are becoming conscious. But we're at this point now, and the reason why your work becomes very instrumental is because you provide a material basis to understand how ideas can actually move to actual material change. And so that's that critical consciousness aspect, right? That becomes very important. So with that being said, I'm also interested. There's a few things that I definitely want to talk about. I would love to talk to you about James Boggs and technology, and that could be something else. Because it's just like you, I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in this notion of the world without work, this notion of after capitalism, right? I'm thinking about this, how do we think beyond struggle? So again, I'll plug that. I'll reach back out to you a little bit later as we kind of develop that. But what are some of the contours of the thought that you have, or the work that you have presented now? We went over those contours. What questions are you thinking about now? Where you're leading to? And I know that's a tough question because we're always thinking about, multiple things. But give me one or two, something that you're kind of thinking about in this moment.
Yeah, well, how do I say this? Well, first of all, I've been working to help edit a novel that a dock worker who I knew before he passed away asked me to complete. And he was a Bay Area dock worker who was a leader in his union, but also a really intelligent and thoughtful. And so his autobiographical novel called Presente hopefully will come out next year, right? I've never worked on a novel before. His name was Herb Mills. But basically he talks a lot about how he helped organize campaigns to refuse to load U.S. weapons aboard ships in the 70s and 80s that supported militaristic or fascist regimes in El Salvador and Chile, right, and other places. And so I continue to believe that workers can exert power, not just in their own cities and countries, but beyond. And I think that's actually really important because we live in a more connected world, right? I think globalization as a new phenomenon is somewhat overdone. I think we actually have had a global world for centuries, perhaps. But it's different, and it is important to think about, right? And I think about how can we, in solidarity with others, because as hard as things are in the United States, those of us who have traveled throughout Africa and other parts of the world know that actually things are harder in many other places. And it's not coincidence, of course, that those places are generally people of color, right? And so how do we help those people? Again, another sort of notion that's popular nowadays, mutual aid, right? Along with solidarity, how can, in other words, ordinary people help other ordinary people, right? In this sort of more horizontal, right? Another reason probably that people are interested in the IWW and their ideas. So I'm interested in, I'm thrilled. I was honored, even though sort of a little nervous and overwhelmed by the idea of working on a novel. But a small publisher named Hardball Press, which also has published the novels of Bill Fletcher Jr., is where hopefully that will be. The other big thing I think about, which I could sort of hijack this to sort of do, as I often am shameless about, so about 4 years ago, I started something called the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project in the city of Chicago, obviously. In 1919, there was a so-called Red Summer, where dozens of communities saw massive racial violence, including where you are, Washington, D.C., of course, in the summer, just days before the Chicago Race Riot broke out, the Washington, D.C. Race Riot. Well, all this time I've spent coincidentally and randomly in Berlin opened my eyes to how Germany sort of embraces and sort of accepts its history of violence and horror. Unlike the United States, where I say in DC, you can spend a lot of time looking around for a memorial to the treatment of indigenous peoples or enslavement of Africans. You'll look a long time because they don't exist, right? But in Berlin, Germany, there's a 5-acre monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, right? And all these public art projects, governmental and non-governmental. And so 38 people killed in 1919 in Chicago, a project in Germany that's in English called Stumbling Stones, but in German called Stolpersteine, where you place small markers outside the last known residence of Holocaust victims so that people now know that the Holocaust happened, and it happened right here in our places, not just somewhere other. 38 markers will be located on Chicago sidewalks at the locations where people were killed in 1919. And actually, we just received a grant from the city for several $100,000. I just met Mayor Brandon Johnson for the first time on Monday, on Juneteenth, when he presented our group there and others these awards. So we are using public art to raise awareness about the history of racial violence in the city of Chicago, not just because that in and of itself is important, but also because the city of Chicago remains the most segregated city in the country. And that is in no small part due to the racial violence of 1919. Afterwards, elites turned to other means like restrictive covenants and then later redlining to contain Black people to certain South Side and then later West Side neighborhoods, right? We also use historic tours through bikes and bus in order to raise awareness of this history of racial violence and racial segregation, as well as resilience. And in fact, a few days ago, one of my partners and I led a tour with 15 Black teenagers in Bronzeville to these locations, right? And we love delivering these tours, although our anniversary event on July 22nd will hopefully see upwards of 300 people join us on bikes and bus in Bridgeport and Bronzeville. But the public art that we're doing is another central part of our work. And we've also worked with the Chicago Public Schools so that 10th grade US history students for the first time ever will be taught this history. And so through a variety of ways, tours, art, traditional schooling, we are engaging in public history and public art to attack amnesia, willful as it often is. We are thrilled with this work that we're doing, but essentially the time that I might have been working on a new book, I've been devoting to this project in Chicago, which is deeply meaningful and hopefully impactful, and work that I'm very proud of, and has also connected me with some wonderful people, including our artists, are victims of violence, right? The first person killed in 1919 was a 17-year-old Black male named Eugene Williams, killed for swimming in Lake Michigan in a so-called white part of the lake, killed by a white man, and then police refused to arrest the killer. That was the spark, not the ultimate cause of that violence. And the victims of violence today, some of them are trained by Firebird Community Arts, a West Side art studio whose artists are all victims of violence, survivors, and they're all African-American too. And so they are the metaphorical descendants of Eugene Williams, right? And so our artists, I'm the director or co-director of this project with my friend Franklin Cozy Gay, who's a public health professional by trade. But our artists are actually these young people who are, it's not just that they're the descendants, it's that they actually arguably are victims of violence because of the failures of Chicago and America to sort of live up to the promise of racial equality and reparations, right? And so why do young Black people in Chicago or DC or other cities continue to be the disproportionate victims and perpetrators of violence, right? It's because of the failures, right? And so our artists are also not just are sort of creating for us, they're with us, right? And so the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 commemoration project has been and in the near future will be my primary sort of non-teaching work, and makes me proud to do it, but also means that I'm not currently working on a new book. but that's okay. It doesn't cause me to lose any sleep about that.
And I'm with you. And the lasting implications, or the lasting part of the work that's what we're intended to do. Of course, the university has its, it has its structures and working on a book, but these projects are very, very important because they're generational. Of course, someone would pick up the book maybe 50, 20, 30, 15 years ago, right? You wrote something 50 years ago, people pick it up now. But, this work becomes important. And I share, your sentiment there, because I too am involved in it, in developing those types of projects as well, particularly community-based, community-led, community-based as well. Peter Cole, thank you so much for the conversation today. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us and sharing some of your work, but also setting the platform for the work that's ahead for many of us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk with you. And obviously, if it's not obvious for your audience, what you do with your podcast and your radio work is another example of how to sort of engage public, to sort of connect scholarship, which often can be opaque and obscure, to a much larger and different audiences. And so, I share your sort of hope and vision, and thank you for the work. And thanks again to inviting me to sort of speak with you.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. Follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram at Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research content contributor and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Orderson, technology advisor it's Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.